All right, everybody. Let's start it from the beginning. How Jack Yates High School got started in Third Ward. Okay, from the beginning. 1893, when they gave blacks the first high school, which it was called Colored High School. And later on it became Booker T. Washington. But in 1893, they gave black a elementary school that white kids had, but they gave it to blacks and it became Colored High School. And it was out in Fourth Ward, what we know as Freedom Town, right next to Antioch Baptist Church. So now, you have to remember now, this is 1893, this is before 1900. Houston had only 6 wards. Anything outside of those 6 wards was not part of Houston. It was part of HISD. Should I say it was part of Harris County, y'all, I take it back. It was part of Harris County. And therefore, Houston Independent School District did not go outside of Houston. But the kids was welcome to come and join Houston Independent School District in the 1893 all the way up until the 1900s. Then we're looking at places that had been annexed into Houston, which was, let's start out on the north side, which was Acres Home, Cashmere and Trinity Garden, along with City Gas, and also Harrisburg, and also Sunnyside, and also Acres Home. All of these communities, Houston annexed it. They was part of Harris County, but they was not part of the city of Houston. So therefore, HISD, which was Houston Independent School District, didn't have no say-so over these kids that was out there in the suburbs. During them days, they call it the suburbs because it was outside of the Houston city limits. But since they was in Harris County, they could go to these schools that Houston had, which was the only black high school, which was Colored High. But 33 years later, Colored High was getting overcrowded because they had kids that was coming from such places as Fifth Ward, such places as Sixth Ward. And then you had blacks that was moving in Third Ward. Then you had the blacks that was already living in Fourth Ward, which was Freedom Town. Then they got to get overcrowded. And the black leaders at that time, Clifton Frederick Richardson, who was the first black to get a newspaper here, and it was called the Houston Informer. Then you had another black leader, which was Dr. Covington. Dr. Covington was one of the first black doctors here in the city of Houston. And then you had another minister who also came in and helped to tell our HISD to build a new school for blacks, high school. And this is when HISD decided to build a new school in 1925. And the blacks, such was Mr. Richardson, Dr. Covington, also Dr. Bowie, and also Dr. Banfield and Dr. Minor. All these was doctors. So they convinced HISD, if they're going to build a school out in Third Ward, they want to make sure that they have one of the best principals. And one of the best principals was already a principal over at Colored High, and his name was James D. Ryan. So when they built this high school and they opened it up, And February the 8th, 1926, and all the black leaders such as Mr. Richardson and along with other black leaders told HISD they wanted Mr. Ryan, James E. Ryan, to come over there and open up that school because he was the best qualified principal that didn't mind fighting for blacks and their rights, and he wasn't afraid to confront white people when he thought things was not going equally or blacks was treated unfair. That's why they wanted Mr. James D. Ryan to come over there to open up this new school, because this is a brand new school that HISD is building, because see, they didn't build Colored High for blacks. That was a school that white gave blacks. It took them 33 years before they can finally build a new school, and it was called Jack Yates, and they wanted to name that school after the minister who helped orchestrated blacks to go out and buy land, which was the Emancipation Proclamation, and was the first park that was donated to the whole state of Texas, and that was called Emancipation Park. So they wanted to make sure, and Reverend Jack Yates used to also, when he was a minister at Antioch, he used to also teach blacks how to read and write and how to spell. That's why they wanted to make sure that they named that school after Reverend Jack Yates. And it opened the doors February 8, 1926, as we celebrate 99 years. But now, when the doors was open, now you had kids that wanted to go to Colored High, but they couldn't go. When you're talking about kids that lived out there in Sunnyside, kids that were living out in City Gas, so they couldn't go, but they could go to Colored High. So when they opened up Jack Yates in 1926, all the black kids, even though they weren't living in Houston, but they was living in Harris County, and they wanted to make sure that they got their education, especially people like Mr. Richardson, who owned the Informer, the only black newspaper that they had here up until 1965, and then Julius Carter opened up the Forward Time. But we're talking about Jack Yates High School. And when they opened it up, and they made sure that Mr. James D. Ryan would leave Colored High now to open up the new Jack Yates High School. Now you had kids that was going from Harrisburg that wanted to come to Jack Yates. You had kids that was coming from Sunnyside wanted to go to Jack Yates if they wanted their high school diploma. And then you had kids that was coming from Piney Point that was going to Jack Yates. Because see, at first, everybody before 1926, everybody had to go to Colored High if they wanted a high school diploma. And Colored High was getting so crowded they couldn't take everybody. They could only take a certain amount of people to go to Colored High. Mainly people from the ward area, such as 4th Ward, 5th Ward, and 3rd Ward. Kids that were living out there in the suburbs, that we call the suburbs, is anything outside of Loop 610. Let me educate you guys so you know what's going on. Anything outside of Loop 610, Houston annexed that. That was always part of Harris County, but it wasn't part of Houston, Texas. And if it wasn't part of Houston, Texas, HISD really wasn't responsible for them coming to school. But due to the fact, Mr. Richardson, who had the Informer, which was the newspaper, it wasn't no TV during them days, y'all. So let's forget that. Only thing it was a newspaper and radio. And we didn't have a black radio station. So the only thing we had was the Informer, which was a newspaper, to inform us blacks about ourselves. But now, we're looking at 1893. But now at Colored High, you had people at Fifth Ward had to come to Colored High because they didn't have no Phyllis Wheatley. But as soon as Jack Yates opened up in 1926, a year later, they opened up a North Side school, which was Phyllis Wheatley. And it became the largest black high school in the United States. Phyllis Wheatley was so crowded when it opened up in 1927 that everybody and the teachers, along with the students, they all had to take shifts to come to that school. It was that crowded. But now we're talking about the history of how Jack Yates got started. And when Mr. Ryan came over there to open up that school, he wanted to make sure that Jack Yates would have a good athletic program. So what he did, Mr. Ryan went to Gary, Indiana, and he went and got Mr. William Holland and brought Mr. William Holland to Houston along with Mr. William Holland family to come in to help orchestrate the athletic department of Jack Yates. Because the guy that was at Colored High, which was Coach Lockett, who they named Lockett Junior High School after, he did not want to leave Colored High. So therefore, Mr. Ryan left and went and got Mr. William Holland. He wanted to make sure he had someone that didn't mind sticking up and voicing his opinion to make sure that blacks would not get mistreated. And that's why he went up north and got Mr. William Holland, because he had been used to dealing with white people. But as I say, 1893, it took them 33 years. When I say they, HISD. Because remember that Colored High, you had all the kids that was in First Ward. We don't want to forget about them. You had all the kids in First Ward, Third Ward, Fourth Ward, and Fifth Ward, and Sixth Ward. Second Ward was Hispanic, so they could go to such school as Milby, also other places as Jeff Davis. They could go to those schools, but blacks couldn't go. But now we're talking about 1926 when Jack Yates opened up. Mr. Ryan took most of the teachers that he knew that could help him and help this new school, the state-of-the-art school, which is you looking at right here, Jack Yates 2610 Elgin, to open up this new school and to make sure that blacks will not misuse the school and keep the school open and keep it updated and keep it clean so that white HISD could start building other black schools. That's the reason why they came up with Phyllis Wheatley a year later. But as we talk about the history, and when Mr. Holland came in to orchestrate the athletic department, therefore Jack Yates 2610 Elgin stayed there and was also recommended as one of the highest schools, black schools in the country. The reason why, because HISD, when they built that school for blacks, which was Jack Yates, they wanted to make sure it was an up-to-date school so that white America and the white people here could be able to say, this is Jack Yates. This is the school that we really is behind in helping blacks. See, because when they got Phyllis Wheatley, they didn't build Phyllis Wheatley, no. Phyllis Wheatley was just like Colored High, Booker T. Washington. They gave that school to blacks. But Jack Yates, they built it. That's why they put so much money into Jack Yates in 1926 at 2610 Elgin. as we celebrate our 99th anniversary here at Jack Yates. How Jack Yates got started. And therefore, they stayed at this building, 2610 Elgin. They stayed in this building, and it was a junior and senior high school. It went from the 7th grade to the 11th grade. And then in 1949, they added another year, so it went from the 7th to the 12th. But now, as Jack Yates was getting so overcrowded, now, in 1956, that they decided to say, hey, went to HISD and said they need to try to build a junior high school for blacks. HISD wasn't going for it. They knew the school was overcrowded because you had kids that was going from Sunnyside. There wasn't no Worthing. You had kids that was going from Piney Point. And then you also had kids that was going from Harrisburg. They all trying to fit into this little bit of school right here, 2610 Elgin. So white school board, along with Miss White, Miss Charles White now is on the school board. So now we got one black representation. So therefore in 1956, they voted to give blacks Johnston Junior High School, because the Jewish people that was in that area, which that area was not, it was annexed into Houston, because that area where Johnston was, which we know as Miller, that was part of Riverside Terrace, and Houston didn't annex Riverside Terrace until 1927. I mean, my bad, 1924, when they annexed it. So, but by 1956, it is part of Houston. That's why HISD told the Jewish people that they would build them a new school. Where the Jewish people now was moving out of Third Ward, moving out to Braeswood, they would build them a new school for them to be able to go to their school, which was called Johnston, which was out there in Maryland, which is out there in Braeswood, which that's where the Jewish people were moving. Once they found out that blacks were moving in and found out 288 was coming, and therefore they moved out there to Braeswood. So therefore they gave us that junior high school. But they also took the name Johnston and they took it out there to Braeswood. And we had to name our junior high school, which was the first junior high school, after Mr. William Miller. Now with Mr. William Miller, he used to be the principal of Colored High. He was the assistant principal under Mr. E.O. Smith. And when Mr. E.O. Smith went out to open up the new Phyllis Wheatley in 1927, then Mr. William E. Miller got to be the principal of, now it's called Booker T. Washington. In 1927, they changed the name to Booker T. Washington. But as we talk about this history of Jack Yates and how it got started, most of all, we're looking at 1926, and then you're talking about 14 years later, Mr. Holland took over the school because Mr. Ryan had passed away. And when Mr. Holland took over the school, he knew how to keep the academic going because he had learned that from Mr. James D. Ryan. Now what he needed, Mr. Holland needed, excuse me, to bring in a person who knew about the athletic department. And therefore he went to Chicago and got a professional baseball player that played in the Negro League, because the Negroes couldn't play into the major league. This way before Jackie Robinson came on the scene. And they went and got an all-star. When I say they, Mr. Holland went and got an all-star baseball player that played for Monarch, the Negro League, and brought him in and his family from Chicago and brought him in to help run the administration athletic department. and his name was Andrew Pat Patterson. And they stayed there at 2610 Elgin. They stayed there until September of 1958. And that's when they built the new Jack Yates.